Hey everybody, here we are again in our, I think I calculated 27th week in a row of our forest ecology series with Mark. And as you guys know, Mark is there with me tonight. And we just finished another webinar just before this with Evan Folds on soil fertility. And if you get a chance, go back and watch the replay of that. Go enjoy it. And some of you were there live too. And I don't have a lot else other announcements other than we're doing 9. That's almost more than 2 hands full of live presentations this week. This will be our, let's see, 3, 2, 2. So this is our 7th, and we'll have 2 more tomorrow. We've got our alternative health in the afternoon with Dr. Mendez talking about nutrition and your health. And then the Sustainable Design Group with Peter Allen, actually, Mark, one of your neighbors. They're interviewing Peter tomorrow. So that's our schedule moving ahead for the week, and I'm going to just turn it over to Mark. Go ahead, my man.
All righty. Well, hey there, everybody. Hopefully you're all enjoying this beautiful winter weather here. It's the picture that you see on the screen. It does not look like that right now. It's all white and blowy and snowy. Well below 0 last night, and then the wind kicked in this morning. Top of the wind turbine tower, which is right up here in the middle of that screen right there, at the top of that wind turbine tower right there, 100-mile-an-hour winds today. Let's see, last week we were talking about plant communities, and the week before last, and then we started to talk about relationships between organisms, and we didn't quite get time to finish all of those. And so we'll go ahead and we'll do a wee bit of review in order to set us up for the context where we'll finish on different relationships between organisms. This evening, we've been talking about plant communities, a collection or an assemblage of organisms within a particular area at any given time. If it's only the plants that are considered, it's a plant community. If all the organisms are considered, it's a biotic community or a biome. These are words that will just spill out of my mouth by accident, and we'll want to have a working understanding of those terms. John Curtis, he's actually one of the founders of the school, so to speak, of ecosystem description, of plant community description that is predominant in ecological studies today. And he was, of course, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I did not have him as a professor. I was not even born before he was no longer working there. Now, plant communities are emergent properties of landscape ecosystems. We went through the history of some of the changing thought of plant communities. Once upon a time, the plant communities were described as like this superorganism, a group of plants that always are found together and that have a life cycle just like a single organism would. Then there was another line of thought that said, well, they're actually like organs within a body instead of organism itself. And then over time, it's come to be that these are emergent properties of the landscape ecosystems. They emerge from the site conditions, and there are many, 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 many different site conditions, of which we've gone through zillions, and we'll go through several zillion more. There are move my screen. There are sometimes distinct lines between plant communities. Like if you look in the upper right here, this bald patch, and there's this very clear line. It's not a smooth transition at all. These are different site conditions than here. It may be the soil type is different. It may be exposure to the sun. This is just an extreme example of how exposure to the sun. On this side here, this is obviously warmer, drier. Then this side is colder. There's actually more vegetation on that south-facing sunny side than there is on the north-facing cold side. In other locations, different latitudes, you'll have the same effect that south side, this is the northern hemisphere, is warmer and drier. But in this case here, in the central Rocky Mountains, North America, this is too hot and too dry, and there's fewer species there. More species on the shadier, moister side. So just because a site has well-drained sand on it doesn't mean that you're going to find the same group of plants over and over again. Just because you see a south-facing slope doesn't mean you're going to find the same community of plants. Just because you see a well-drained or a poorly drained site doesn't mean you're going to find the same suite of species living together, the same plant communities. There's a lot of variables that work together, and it's our job as land managers, as restoration agriculture land managers, to understand how our site is working, the context within which it is working, and then make sense of it and make management decisions that are helpful for us and for our agricultural operation. Some of the magic happens in the transitions between one plant community type and another plant community type. These transition zones, also called ecotones, are where a lot of magic happens. And what I've got is a few examples here of the boundary between grasslands and forested lands. The savanna is this particular ecotone, has many, if not most of the species of a grassland, of a prairie, has many, if not most of the species of a forested, closed canopy forested area in the same region, but it also has things that only exist there. There's more species diversity in the ecotones and the transitions. Some ecotones are smooth transitions. They're a gradient. You go from high density closed canopy forest to a thinner canopy forest. Now you get some grasses underneath to eventual grassland. That's a transition from a forest through savanna into a grassland. Other places it's abrupt. Like we see in the back of this grassland here, it looks to me like there's an abrupt tree line. What are the causes of these abrupt ecosystem changes? Well, this is really obvious here. We talked about this last week. We have roads that form boundaries. We have property lines that form boundaries. We have different management techniques on different sides of fence lines. This is a corn, beans, alfalfa hay rotation for a dairy. This is New Forest Farm, trees, shrubs, bushes, and vines, chestnuts, hazelnuts, apples, and pine nuts, animals, and so on, the produce. And this is actually a recreational property where the guy mows about 160 acres of grass and lets it all grow back to grass for whatever reason. He's got these specimen trees planted here and there, and a McMansion down the way with a spectacular view. So different property management styles, different goals, and different landowner objectives also are determinants of plant communities. This plant community, for the most part, that exists here is a mimic of what was there 100 years ago, but it wouldn't have existed without myself and my family living here and making our way as an economic enterprise as New Forest Farm. We talked also about the physiological amplitude, the range that a species occurs. Now, if you look at this one right here, we've got the pines going from very dry to very alkaline, very wet, very acid. I don't see any very wet alkaline pines in this particular this little ecogram. But part of what we can use something like this for is to understand that the species that we use have a wide range of tolerances. So it's not just the soil, it's not just the water, it's not just the acidity or alkalinity of a site. It's not how well drained it is. It's a whole bunch of those different conditions conspiring together, plus the disturbance regime that will determine what plant communities exist on a site. So we have a wide range of species to choose from. They have certain disturbance regimes that they are adapted to, and they have certain conditions that they are also adapted to, and this picture right here shows it. If we have a site that is solid rock, that was in Minnesota or Michigan, whoever owns Isle Royale National Park, like a black granite basalt type rock, a south-facing little crack in the rock. There's enough water for this tree to grow. Who knows how old this tree is? It could be 100 years old. Zero soil. In the wintertime, it's like this. It's the Arctic. Screaming winds, cold snow. In the summertime, it's probably 300 degrees, like a solar oven on a south-facing rock. And yet here in this mid-temperate latitudes, we've got this white spruce, this is in Washington State, of enormous, enormous girth and height. We have a wide range of species to choose from, and the site conditions to a certain extent will determine which traits will survive. If you can't survive, 50 below zero, you won't survive here. If you can't survive in the wind, you won't, and you won't reproduce. And those traits that allow you to survive 50 below zero get propagated through in this system here. These ones with the snow perhaps wouldn't survive there. They may be able to handle the extreme cold, but this one somehow can handle extreme heat and also lengthy periods of drought. Whereas this one right here, it doesn't get many challenges at all, except maybe too much fertility and too much water that it has to deal with. So different traits are selected out by the extremes that will kill the variants that don't have that gene in them. And then also there are certain things that happen that will stimulate, trigger certain genes. Gene silencing is one, and gene expression is another, that certain genes turn on when certain conditions are met, and other ones will just shut right down and not express at all. These are important later on. We'll get to that when we're talking about species selection and breeding. As time goes on the site changes. The longest lived organisms change the site conditions. These pines right here have been dropping pine needles on this forest floor for perhaps hundreds of years. They're casting a deep shade. They're somewhat acidic. If you can't tolerate deep shade, acid, poorly decomposed litter layer, then you're not going to reproduce. So the plant community, in addition to surviving in a certain niche, I say the word niche and not niche, not only surviving in a certain niche, they also create new ones just because of them being there and living there. Once again, this is a totally different site. This is maple and eastern hemlock. Look at the ground cover. What I want you guys to start looking at here is all of the vegetation, not just the trees here, because we're going to start talking later on about evaluating site quality and to understand how the vegetation is working and living, thriving, or not thriving on the site is how we'll evaluate different sites. We were talking last week, and this is used in the Permaculture Designer's Manual for an easy tool, a designer's tool. Put a plus minus and a zero, plus minus zero, and put it across. Plus plus. This is minus plus. This is zero plus. Plus minus, minus minus, zero zero. Interactions between species. We talked about predation of one preying on the other. The lion obviously eating the zebra. It's not just large organisms, it's smaller organisms. This predation can be used as a tool. Having plenty of amphibians in your system is excellent insect control, very good insect control. Having lots of birds in your system is also good insect control. Chickadees are fantastic species in that they're really omnivorous. They'll eat lots of coarse weed seeds. So if you have lots of weeds in a lot of your agricultural areas, velvet leaf and giant ragweed, put a chickadee, put like a bird feeder over there with some sunflower seeds, because when some are hanging out on the bird feeder, the others will be hanging out eating all of your giant ragweed seeds or your velvet leaf seeds, whatever your large seeded annual weeds are. So predation can be used as a tool. Commensalism, the cattle graze on grass and could care less about the egrets. The egrets are benefiting from the insects being kicked up by the cattle grazing. We have quite a few snowy egrets near us that have a similar relationship with the cattle. You'll see them down in the river bottoms, these big white birds walking along with the cattle. We also have cowbirds that follow along with the cattle and walk on the cattle's back. I think that's more of a mutualistic relationship. They're both helping each other out, that the cowbirds are helping the cattle to have fewer biting insects on them. So just because the cow and the cowbird have a plus-plus mutualistic relationship doesn't necessarily mean that the cowbird has a mutualistic relationship with other organisms. Let's take bluebirds, for example. I like having bluebirds around. They're beautiful for one, and they're big-time insectivores. They're what they call, I forgot what it is, obligate. They're obligate insectivores. They are obligated to eat insects. That's basically all that they eat. So they eat a tremendous amount of bugs. They're great pest control. Well, cowbirds will come in and it will kick all of the bluebird eggs out of the nest and lay a cowbird egg in it. And the parent bluebirds raise this cowbird. How a cowbird knows how to do what it does is beyond me. It had never had a parent to teach it how to be a cowbird. It just becomes a cowbird. So even though it might be a commensalism relationship where one benefits and is a neutral on the other one, or even a mutualistic relationship between two organisms, each one of those organisms has other relationships with other species that might be beneficial to one or not to the other. Amensalism, one's negatively impacted and the other one could care less. The black walnut could care less that your tomato plants died underneath. Doesn't benefit very much, but your tomato plants, they're dead. Neutralism, a very common type of interspecies interaction where neither seem to directly affect one another, like salmon living in a stream and dandelions both out in a coastal inlet, or cactus in a desert and mahonia, mountain mahogany, wild grape really don't have anything to do with each other. They're just in the same place at the same time. Parasitism is a symbiotic relationship between species where one, the parasite, benefits at the expense of the other, the host. Of course, I mentioned my favorite, the goosefish over here, mistletoe. Mistletoe, by the way, those of you who have mistletoe on oak, there are medicinal herb companies that purchase mistletoe. It's used as an anti-cancer remedy, herbal remedy. Yeah, so all of these things have some sort of use that we can incorporate into our economic system. Mutualism. This is one that would be nice. In an ideal world, we could create every single relationship on our property as a mutualistic relationship where each one benefits the other one. So the benefit to both. Bees pollinating flowers. The flowers benefit because they get extra seeds come out of the deal. The bees benefit because they get pollen and nectar and they can raise more young. Same with the butterflies. We talk quite a bit, and this is a very significant mutualistic relationship, is the mycorrhizal fungi, especially with tree roots. There's ectomycorrhizal fungi, which is fungi on the outside of the roots, just coats the outside of the roots. It increases the plant's ability to access water, other different mineral nutrients, especially phosphorus. And then there's endomycorrhizal fungi, or vascular arbuscular mycorrhizal, VAM mycorrhizal fungi, that the fungus actually sends its mycelium right inside of the cells of the plants, in between the cells of the plant roots, and it doesn't harm the plant roots at all. It actually is a benefit, increasing nutrient uptake and water uptake. And it's not just bees and butterflies that have some sort of mutualistic relationship here. In pollination services, there are a lot of flowers, and sunflowers are one of them, that a lot of the pollination on sunflowers is by moths, and it's not necessarily during the daytime. So if you're spraying insecticides, growing some sort of plant that requires pollination service, it's not just your honeybees, so you just close up your honeybees and you spray your insecticide and everything's good, right? Well, you know what, if you didn't spray insecticide, you'd also have butterflies and moths that may be pollinating at night. And it's not just insects that do pollinating for us. This hummingbird right here is obviously benefiting from the nectar on that flower, and this flower is going to benefit because the next flower that this hummer goes to is going to pollinate that flower, additional seeds. Mutualism. Of course, mutualism in the spreading of seeds from the large animal broadcast, I guess you call them, deposited, carried around, honey locust seeds, Kentucky coffee tree, squirrels planting nuts, mice making little stashes, ground squirrels and mice. Quite frequently, I'll see a little clump of chestnut trees growing randomly somewhere out on the farm. And evidently what that was is a mouse or a ground squirrel or a chipmunk had buried a big stash of nuts the previous fall and either didn't survive the winter, got eaten by somebody, and the trees then sprouted right on the spot. So they're actually performing me a service, because then I can dig them up and move them somewhere else. And they're obviously performing a service for the chestnut, the one that they don't eat. And of course, there are animals carrying seeds around. ants on the peony, that the peony blossom will not open unless the ants somehow tickle, stimulate, or eat glue off of the surface. I don't know exactly. I don't know if any of you guys looked it up either, what the ants are actually doing. I've seen them eating goo, and I've also seen them working aphids. They'd be carrying aphids around this around the flower head, and obviously getting the honeydew secretion from the aphids. And we finished last week's on squirrel poop. It was one of my favorite discoveries when I first started reading scientific literature that was showing clear cuts that they were having higher regeneration rates and faster growth rates with trees planted in clear cuts when they were X distance from within the edge of a clear cut. So if you made clear cuts smaller, you'd have this additional boosted growth all the way across the whole entire clear cut. And then they dug underground, and they saw like the soil mycelia went a certain way, and then after a certain distance from the trees, the site is hotter, less shaded, it's less humid, so it's hotter and drier, less fungus survives there. But one of the significant things that they discovered is that these squirrels were eating fungus, eating mushroom heads, and then when they poop, the spores would go right through the squirrel and be deposited in squirrel poop and mouse poop. And so while up in Alaska, I would intentionally feed red squirrels on certain stumps. And I'd pick mushrooms and put them on those stumps, and you'd see them sitting out on the stumps and eating the mushrooms. And then I'd sweep the poops into a little cup, not one that I drank out of, probably a used yogurt container, and then put a half a dozen or so squirrel poops in the bottom of every hole with a tree, just because. And in theory, according to all the papers that I've read, there were mycorrhizal fungi spores that then inoculated my tree roots and helped them to survive and grow. Now, competition is a relationship between two species where they occupy the same landscape unit, and both of their yields are decreased temporarily as a result of them being together with one another. They're both competing for the same resource, for the same water, for the same soil nutrients, for the same sunlight that's coming down. And both of them are impacted, and it's only by some trait that one or the other organism has that one will eventually come to dominate that site and quote unquote win the competition. And you've seen this slide a bunch of times. This is a American basswood, both these trees here. They're very understory tolerant. They'll grow underneath the fully closed canopy forest. And once they get full sun, they're fairly fast growing, but they're rather slow growing in the shade. So what they've been doing is been growing up in the shade of a eastern red cedar, juniper, as you Rocky Mountain folks would call it. And through the years was slowly growing its branches right through the foliage. And if you've ever seen a eastern red cedar juniper, you know how deep dark that is. If you're trying to put a branch through it, there's like no light. Why would you go through? Well, another branch through and another branch through until eventually they would interpenetrate the whole entire red cedar. Roots, meanwhile, down below, basswood roots are very shallow and fibrous, and so they can take up a lot of water. Even more so than the eastern red cedar. And then once it starts to get an advantage, starts to get a little bit more water, just enough water, a little bit more sunshine, then its growth kicks in. And you can see up here, we've had quite a bit of elongation here. That's 1 year's worth of growth there. That's 1 year's worth of growth there, and 1 year's worth of growth there. Once it gets enough sunlight, enough water, grows real fast, overshadowed the red cedar. The red cedar does not live in the shade. It will not tolerate shade conditions, and then it just dies. That's a competitive relationship that both of them showed slower growth while they were in competition with one another until one eventually had whatever characteristics it was to dominate that particular site. And if you look at a forest or any woody, brushy area anywhere, the structure, the shape, the height and density of trees and the species composition is one result of competition in a plot like this. As the species interact, the less competitive fail to thrive. And you can see here that some over here have already died and disappeared, whereas these two, this one is like almost finished right down here. These two are, you know, maybe in third place. This is in second place. This guy's gone way over here to find some sunlight, where in the meantime, this one right here has come to dominate. That's winning the so-called competitive race, if you want to call it that, for sunlight, for moisture, for nutrients, and just for plain living space. We can tell which ones are going to die next. This tree right here that I pointed out earlier, this really stunted little one, many people say, oh, that one's going to die next. It won't get any light. It won't get any water. Well, it might be a very understory tolerant tree, such as sugar maple or American beech. And if we were to go ahead and remove all the other trees, it would go ahead and sprout up and grow real tall. If it was an American beech, it could just hang out in the shade and live there for hundreds of years. And eventually these other trees, this is a bur oak, that would eventually die. These are probably both other types of oaks, because this is all an oak and walnut direct seeded planting. So we can look and see, based on the plant characteristics and the competitive interactions, which one is going to die next. And it might not be that one, if that one's got the traits that will help it survive. So we can go in and make a management decision based on the tolerance of those particular trees for shade and competition. Part of what these competitive interactions in the mutualistic, commensalistic, amensalic, neutral interactions, that whole suite of different organism interactions work together to create what we see as a stand of trees, a forest, whether they're high density, closed canopy, or open canopy with grass underneath. If we look at the trees right here, and if we remember from a few weeks ago, when we were showing a site in Virginia that was replanted with longleaf and loblolly pine, at the early stage, all of the trees had full access to sunlight, full access to the soil. They could have all the water that they wanted, all the nutrients that they wanted. There were no competitive effects between trees. Well, then other species, either advanced regeneration from roots and seeds that were already there, or seed coming into a site, other trees get sprouted on that particular site. Now the site is fully occupied, and they all grow at different rates of speed for whatever reason. It could be genetics, it could be microsite difference. You got a little bit, maybe this particular tree landed on the body of an old dead mammoth, and there's all this nutrient stored ready to feed a tree. There will be competitive interactions and other types of interactions, so that some trees start to dominate the larger canopy. Some are co-dominant. They're not quite as big as the dominants, but the dominants are just the biggest ones there. They have light. There's actually a description of how much light the dominant gets compared to, a co-dominant versus an intermediate. And later on, we start to get some that are oppressed and suppressed. And so one that's in an intermediate phase right now, if this dominant continues to grow and overtops this little one right here, this little intermediate tree may begin to die. As we see here, it became totally suppressed, and then eventually it is gone. So we can tell very soon into a system development, this says 15 years here, that's fairly slow for a humid, temperate environment. It's fairly fast for like an arid southwest environment. But these years are totally site-specific and relative. We can look at the crown classes and determine which ones to keep and which ones to remove. If we are looking for timber production, maybe we don't want a huge wide-spreading canopy. We want nice straight trees. Maybe we want more co-dominants and intermediates at this stage. We'll get rid of the dominants. If, however, we want to produce nuts and we want to have a lot of green surface area with a lot of nuts, maybe we'll leave all the dominants and start removing things like this that's starting to impact. Take these intermediates from either side of that dominant, and that's now a boom, big, round, full dominant. So we can use the shapes of the crowns, the crown classes, knowing how they tolerate shade and how they respond to release. Getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but by understanding how the behaviors, I guess you've got to call them behaviors, the behaviors of these different trees when they don't have any competition versus when they do have competition, we can make the informed decisions on how to deal with our stand. There's another crown class that I'm not going to spend much time on. If we're going to plant a system, it's going to be years before we ever get any of these trees. They may be pre-existing trees on your site, like there were a few at New Forest Farm that qualify as this. The trees that I planted are an understory, and they're actually the canopy layer, but there are emergents. They grow up above the general level of the canopy, and it's almost like they could care less what's going down around by their feet. And the white pine in the north is a classic example. Just get up above it, all across the Appalachians, you'll see these big, huge, ragged pines breaking the ridge, and this big, beautiful forest underneath it. But these guys are the true giants. Redwoods will do this. A lot of basswood, I've seen gigantic basswoods as emergent. American chestnut oftentimes was emergent on hills. These emergents were what the British used for ships' masts. And so in early colonial eastern part of the U.S., all of the emergent trees were reserved for the king. You could own the property and the trees all around it, but these were all the king's trees, the king's pines. This is the stem exclusion, the thinning stage. This is where we need to look. What type of crown classes do we have? Which ones are the dominants? Which ones are suppressed? Obviously, these ones are suppressed and not doing well. That one's dead. This is when we make our decision. Is the tree that we leave behind going to thrive or not thrive? And if we look down here at this leaf right here, this happens to be an American beech. We can leave this tree right here. All these gray branches are actually part of this American beech. You can leave that beech in the shade and it's going to be just fine. Whereas these pines aren't going to thrive with shade. So we need to remove some of the other material, get some more sunlight to the crowns of these trees. Doesn't do a pine any good to get sun down here because it doesn't have any green down here. Other trees, some deciduous trees, oaks, for example, if you let sun in and they had some small branches here, they would get some more leaves in here, but not your pines. What's fascinating, look at this right here, how dense that is, how many stems there are per surface area, per unit area. One of the things that bugged me a lot about studying ecology was the fact that all of these scientists, it's almost seemed to me that they wanted to justify their existence, and so they had to have everything mathematically, statistically lined up and proofed and all this kind of stuff. And there are some things, though, that all of a sudden when you find a mathematical relationship that's just magic, it's like, oh my goodness, there is a really, really, really significant number right there. It was found out once upon a time, Pete and Christensen, 1987, back when I was in college, that if you have a young stand of trees, over 1,000 stems per acre, the total volume of trees, of wood per acre kind of approaches this line. As time goes on, fewer trees and fewer trees and fewer trees and fewer trees, they still approach this line, and it ends up being a line of a slope of minus 1.5. It's the minus 3/2 line. So if you want to do a measurement of all of the different trunks of trees that you have on your property, calculate the volume. If you have exceeded this over here, if you're on this side of this line, you got to do some thinning. The closer you are to that line, do some thinning, because if right here, this is when they're really competitive with one another, because they're so densely stocked that it's all that they can do to have enough light to keep going and stay alive. Whereas if you reduce the density, now there's fewer stems per acre. They're further away from that 3/2 line. They'll grow faster. They'll produce more crops. Now I put this over here when we're talking about understory tolerance. This is really important. I've talked about it before. We'll continue to. I want to remember these. When we make a management decision, we want to understand and know how tolerant is that species of suppression. Like, and I'll show a picture of it later on. I've got this block of chestnuts. I was supposed to thin them out a year ago, didn't get around to it, got busy. Well, then This year, for sure, I'm going to get to it, but we had a late spring frost, and most of the blossoms were killed, including the blossoms on several of my highest producing trees. I want to go through and remove all of the trees that don't produce lots of nuts. This year is a 20-year anomaly in that patch, and I don't want to make a major management decision based on one anomalous year, although I do want to have species that are adapted or varieties that are adapted to the site conditions. I want to know how long can I let these trees go in an overcrowded state? How long can I stay here before trees start dying? If you have trees that are very needful of the light, early successional and mid-successional trees really need a lot of light. If they demand a lot of water, you may want to thin sooner rather than later. Have something like the American beech. It's very tolerant of the understory. It can tolerate suppression. Chestnut, American chestnut anyways, can tolerate a tremendous amount of suppression. Also, you want to know the different trees' response to release. If all of a sudden I cut some trees around it for firewood, for mushroom logs, whatever, building materials, that tree that was suppressed, will it all of a sudden return to growing really fast? There are a lot of trees that, especially the early and mid-successional trees, if they are shaded to a certain extent, they'll be growing like this, trying to reach for the light, and all of a sudden, if they
Hopefully that is short term for Mark. He's had this happen before there, so don't panic. I think he might come back here in a second.
brushy over, pardon?
Oh, you were frozen for just a second, but I think it kept you going. So keep going.
There was a overgrown field, and there was one little hickory tree in it that was starting to get suppressed by maples and birches that were growing faster than it. So I removed the birches and some of the maples around it to release this hickory, but it had already been suppressed. And in like the remaining 6 or 8 years that I lived at my parents' house, that tree never woke back up and started growing straight. It just stayed in a stunted state forever. Many trees, we want to look at the crown and bole development. Bole is the trunk of the tree. Once again, this has to do with our goals and our values. Are we raising these trees for timber? And we want to have a nice, straight, tall, clean trunk that will, cut into nice saw logs and make nice big posts and beams. Or are we growing trees for the crown qualities, for apples, for chestnuts, for some sort of nut crop? So we make a decision based on either the trunk or the crown. And stand structure, we'll talk a little bit about this in another slide. The arrangement of trees on the landscape is important for a couple of reasons. One, for our convenience, so we can get through there with equipment, or if we want to graze through there with livestock, and we don't want to thin a stand of trees too rapidly. Otherwise, the ones that are remaining behind may not have any extra support, and wind can come through and cause them to bend or break. And then, of course, we need to know the growth and reproductive characteristics of the trees that we're working with. Are we working with trees that if you go ahead and you do a release cut around, let's take chestnut trees, because I did this again this spring with chestnut, and the trees that you cut down were black locust that sprout back from the stump and from the root quite vigorously. They make their own nitrogen fertilizer. If all of a sudden I open up this stand and have now cut these black locusts so that instead of just having one black locust tree there, now I'll have like 10 or 15 that sprout up next spring. They're going to grow really, really fast. I might actually set back my chestnuts if I have created conditions for these black locusts to grow extra fast. So we'll want to understand how do these trees grow and reproduce, and how will they tolerate our interacting with them. This is an example of our stand structure here and our response to release. If we've seen this picture before, this is a planted red pine plantation. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted this, I guess, way back in the 1930s in northern Minnesota. Red pine mostly, and white pine was also thrown in there. Well, through the years, fire, of course, was seen as a big enemy, so there was a lot of fire suppression. So what's grown up underneath is a lot of balsam fir, which is very shade tolerant. A lot of eastern hemlock is also shade tolerant. Both of them are almost, they can almost be considered weapons grade. They're so incredibly flammable. So if you know, one smoking hippie throws a joint out there, I think I've said that before, lights the thing on fire, you're not only going to burn out the understory, you're going to lose the crown class as well. This is the overstory. Do we go in here and remove the understory to favor these tall trees? How soon will these mature into a useful saw log? Or do we want to remove the overstory and allow the understory to be released and to grow faster? That's a decision that we make. If we remove the understory, what will the stand composition look like? What will be left behind? Will it be widely scattered? Will it be closely packed? Will it be evenly spaced? And once again, that matters a lot for wind throw and survivability that way. If you were to remove the understory with red pines that are this big, yes, these understory trees are using nutrients and moisture that the overstory could use. But these guys are at an age stage of their growth. Notice how the top of their crowns are now rounded off. They're not like a straight, tall Christmas tree growing up. They've started to slow down in their growth, and they're just slowly putting on girth. They aren't using as much fuel and as much energy, respiration energy, as like a teenager would that's in a rapid growth phase. So to remove this understory really wouldn't help these all that much as far as growing faster. If we were to move the overstory, these guys, if they haven't been suppressed too far, they will respond right away. In eastern hemlock, you can grow those down cellar and never suppress them. They'll respond just fine. This is a similar location as the previous one. This had been burned 2 years ago, natural fire. And in Boundary Waters canoe area wilderness, they don't suppress the fires unless it's going to be damaging local communities, that sort of thing. So this had the understory burned out by the fire. That the stand composition, just look at that, how it's a very nice even stand. You still got plenty of light coming through to allow an understory to grow. There's enough water for the understory to grow. And so if we were to thin this out to look like that, we've actually performed some work here, and we've probably gotten some building materials, poles, teepee poles, firewood, whatever it is, building material. And now we've created a new pasture that we can start grazing animals in and have an annual cash flow while simultaneously allowing these slower growing older trees to fatten up and become more economically valuable as timber. This is that chestnut area that I was talking about, that they're starting to exclude one another. There are chestnut trees starting to die because of the competitive effects, too much shade and too much struggle for nutrients. And if you're a tree, for example, you can partition where you send your photosynthate to. You can put it to current growth, you can put it to storage to survive the winter, or you can put it into reproduction. And that's basically the amount of photosynthate that we've got available to us. A tree that's going to be producing hyper amounts of nuts may not be putting it into wood, so it's not necessarily growing as tall to get up into the canopy to get enough sunlight, and or it may not be storing enough energy to survive through the winter. So in this area here, although they have a tremendous tolerance for suppression, they can go ahead and be suppressed and live in the understory for a long period of time. They can't go forever. So I'm thinking that late this winter, I'm going to go through and clear cut this area. It's about a full acre of chestnut trees. Some are 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Of course, some are only thumb thickness. Most of them are like the size of my wrist to the size of my thigh. I'm just going to clear cut them all and make lots of shiitake mushrooms. And that's based on, why did I make that decision? It's based on their tolerance for suppression. It's based on their reproductive capacities, the fact that they will sprout back really quick. And it's based on the fact that I'll have a resource, I'll have created a resource, I'll be inoculating trees with mushrooms that I can sell, I'll be having more grass to be able to graze animals on, and I'll get to start over with this breeding program so that by year 3, if the trees do not produce chestnuts, I cut them down again and then favor the ones that are producing nuts. Yeah, so just follow the reasoning on that. That's why we're doing this whole forest ecology thing, is the decisions that we're going to be making on the ground in restoration agriculture aren't the same as like, oh yeah, put the corn in the hopper and put on some 10-10-10, drive it across the field, go take a family on summer vacation, call the co-op and have them hit it with a Roundup twice. We're making decisions based on ecological processes, the behaviors of plants, everything from the fact that this coppice is readily, that's a fire survival strategy. They're shade tolerant, which means they're late succession. They're understory tolerant trees. They can handle a lot of competition. They already mentioned the sprout back from the root, and they're compatible with the grass. And I want to have grass because that's part of my annual cash flow. These are not, they're not difficult decisions. They're complex, but they're not complicated. And so to have an understanding of how these different species work and how they behave under different conditions is important for us. And this one, if you guys take one thing away from tonight's conversation, not much of a conversation, I'm just sitting here blabbing all the time, is this chart right here. These are the relative understory tolerance of different forest trees in North America. If you're going to be growing a little suburban food forest, one complaint that I've heard a number of different authors make about food forests is that people have planted them too close together and they shade each other out. It's like, well, to me, that's not a problem at all. Too close together, that's an opinion. If they planted them high density and they are now starting to compete with one another, well, that means it's time to make an entry into that stand and do some selection, do some stem exclusion. Instead of letting it happen on its own, we make the decisions. Who do we leave behind? The ones that we can leave behind that can tolerate more shade and more understories, not just shade either. The more tolerant ones and being in the understory are these guys right here. These are the most tolerant. Eastern hemlock and balsam fir for the conifers. Dogwoods, hornbeam, beech, sugar maple are the most tolerant broadleaf trees, and western hemlock, silver firs, Pacific yew for the evergreens in the west. Mid tolerance, white spruce, black spruce, red spruce. Red spruce, I'd almost push that up into the very very tolerant range. Basswood, red maple, American chestnut are also quite tolerant, and then all these spruces in here. Now, the reason why this is saying understory tolerance, and I'm not just saying shade tolerant, it's not only shade that they have to tolerate. They have to tolerate intense competition for water. And I think the next slide that I've got, I'll go back to that. We'll flip momentarily. This one right here, the reason why I took it is here we are. This is a Scotch pine stand. This was planted by my youngest son, Daniel. He was going to grow Christmas trees. He planted this when he was 6 years old, and he knew that in 10 years he could sell these as Christmas trees. He'd be 16 years old, he could buy a car. Well, he never took care of his Christmas trees, and now they're young trees. They're out competing my grasses. I went in last summer, trimmed off a bunch of the branches, chipped them up with my flail chopper. More light comes in, so now the grasses can start to get reestablished underneath it. The reason why I took this picture here is that it was previously thought that it was purely shade that determined whether a tree could survive in the understory. How much shade can it tolerate? How little light can it live with? And that was found to be not exactly the only factor. There was a bunch of Scots pine in the understory that were obviously suppressed. Some researchers severed roots all the way around it. So you figure they're probably severing that little tree's its own roots that are going out into other soil space. Instead of it harming the little tree actually responded by growing better. So then they excavated around the tree and they discovered that what they had done is all these other trees in the forest were going into that little block of soil and taking nutrients and moisture from that little tree. So oftentimes it was competition for moisture and nutrients in the understory, not just shade, that determined the understory tolerance of these trees. So the shade tolerance is one. The water deficit and nutrient deficit is another. So these understory trees are growing quite well. There's American beech, eastern hemlock that's in here. I thought I saw some balsam fir, but I guess I don't right now. This is in New Hampshire. Many trees are more shade tolerant than they might appear to be, but part of their situation is their respiration rate. If you think of sunshine and photosynthesis, that's like a tree eating. So the tree eats during the day, it gets all the sun that it can. If you're in the understory, you're not getting much sun, not getting much nutrients from the soil, but you've eaten all day. Well, now at night you're still breathing, you're still having cellular respiration going on, and so their respiration rates are so high that they would exceed their photosynthesis rate and end up killing themselves because their metabolism is just going too fast. And red maple is a good example of that. That it's very shade tolerant, but it has a higher respiration rate, and it just requires a certain quantity of light and nutrients in order for it to survive, persist in an understory. So go back to this chart right here. Print that one off and just understand. These are the trees that are going to grow real fast. They're your early in your life trees. They will die very quickly. Pin cherries, 15, 20 years. Black locust, one of the miraculous and beautiful, wonderful things about black locust, I can grow them 50-50 with chestnut, and they totally overtop the chestnut. Chestnut struggle for a few years. I go on and I cut the black locust when they're good pole size, building material size, and then the chestnuts have more sun. They respond to the release really well, and they have all the extra nitrogen released by the black locust roots, and they can very quickly shade out and just eliminate the black locust, and then I don't have tractor tires that get punctured anymore. So print this page off and pin that up on a wall somewhere. This is one of your guides to managing your restoration agriculture system well. All right, think about what we've done. We've discussed all these different factors that have affected the development of our site within our ecosystem framework: climate, stand establishment, site occupation, advanced regeneration, stem exclusion, understory reinitiation, old growth, disturbance, water, fire, effects of animals, specialized adaptations of certain species, successional change, plant communities, emergent properties of landscape, physiographic effects, the slope, the aspect, the geological effects, the soil types, parent material, soil moisture, latitude, elevation, temperature regime, day length, rainfall amounts, types, patterns, evaporation rate, biological legacies, state of soil development, wind patterns, disturbance, frequency, severity, intensity, or lack of disturbance, surrounding plant communities. We've seen examples of how to affects community composition, how we can use this knowledge to guide our actions as restoration agriculture practitioner. Woo! We've done all that. Can you imagine that? All of that is the information that we put into our little onboard brainial computer here to make decisions that make sense ecologically. It's not difficult, it's complex, not complicated. Now, what we're going to do here, let me see what we've got for time. We are at a time, Wayne, where okay, let's go through 3 more slides, and then we'll take a break for some questions, because I've got another half hour anyways to go here. But all of those factors play into our use of 3 tools, and Alan Savory talks about these 3 tools over and over again. And when it all comes down to it, we have 3 tools as land managers at our disposal. One is technology. Fire is a type of technology. A mower is a type of technology. A saw is a type of technology. Herbicide is a type of technology. We have animal impact. So fire, animal impact, and rest. How are we going to use fire, animal impact, and rest in our mixed polyculture systems of perennial woody species with annual species, perennial grasses, with livestock, fruits, nuts, berries, all of these different species going on? How do we use these 3 main tools in an ecological context so that we can derive our livelihood from finding a piece of degraded property, upgrading it ecologically so it has improved nutrient, carbon cycling, moisture cycling, water cycling, produces food, fuels, medicines, and fiber for people in perpetuity, because this is a natural system that we have decided to manage in an ecological manner. And I think I'll pause there and take questions instead of going for another half hour.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We'll go next week. You've got some great questions too. I'm not going to do these in any real order, but I'm going to start with this one because it was relevant. So, guys, one thing. This isn't a question; it's a comment. Remember, you can get the replay of this, and when he said copy off that page, just go to the replay, stop it, and do a screen capture of that, and you can get that page. But he asked, what book was that from, Mark, or what
that was
article?
From the Forest Ecology. That one was from the Forest Ecology, 4th edition, Burton, Barnes, et al. You go back to
Justin asks a couple. Oh,
go ahead. It's just one of the. I think it's the second webinar has the books in it.
Yeah, back a ways. Justin asked this a couple times. How can I store water in loamy sand? And he was asking whether he needed to bring in some kind of amendment or what.
Well, it depends on what he means by store water. If you mean making a pond, that's one thing. The way to get water to stay within that system is with biology. The quickest biology to get in there is dense, fibrous, grassy roots. Get that a good dense pasture established. One of the ways to make sure you get a good dense pasture established, do a Midwestern BioAg soil test and amend for your major deficiencies to get a good pasture established. We'll then start getting your trees established in there. All of the biology, the roots, all of the living creatures that are in there, that's all water. This redwood tree right here in the center of this picture, that thing is full of water. Zillions of gallons worth of water stored right there on the site. So in a sandy loam soil, biology. If you want to make a pond, it's a different story. We've got a whole set of techniques, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about this week.
Paul Miller had asked a question actually in another one of our sessions, and I think he was wondering about the ecograms that you used. And he even mentioned some specifically EIV Ellenberg indicator values, ecograms. He didn't go further. I don't know whether he was just looking at where to get those or what. Maybe you interpret that.
I'm not familiar right now. You know what? When you said Ellenberg indicator values, I'm like, oh yeah, I know what those are. What the hell are those? I've heard of that before. So I must have known about those, and I don't know what those are. Ecograms are basically it's just a big chart, and they go through an area and they put it on that scale, whether you're using water, soil moisture or acidity as the different axes on it, or latitude as different axes, and then you just do frequency maps. Count the species of trees that are there and what's the frequency of their appearance. And the one that's like in the middle, that's the most largely represented, that's the one that's most widely represented on that particular soil type or latitude, whatever your axis and abscissa are. That's how they generate those ecograms. It's a lot of data collection, a lot of stuff for undergrad students just to go out and collect data, count.
Sam has two really good questions. One is pretty easy, probably. Is the relative understory tolerance of selected North American forest trees in the Forest Ecology text, or where did that come from?
Yes, that's in the Forest Ecology, 4th edition, Burton v. Barnes et al.
All right.
Go ahead.
Well, the next one is just more specific, again from Sam. As we talk about managing during the stem exclusion phase, you talk about intervening in favor of the trees which match our goals. Do you think that you are directing succession, accelerating succession, or both? Or neither?
Well, to answer the first one, you're directing succession? Absolutely. When you are making a conscious choice and disturbing a site, you are directing succession somehow. We want to do that in an intelligent manner. If we go into a site of let's go back to that Virginia site, from a few weeks ago that had all the planted loblolly longleaf pines that were there, plus a whole host of other species that were existent in that. If we were to remove all of the trees except for the sugar maple and beech, the sugar maple and beech are late successional trees. They'll hang in there. They'll be here 200 years from now, 300 years from now. They'll eventually dominate that site because they're so understory tolerant. If we remove everything except for the maple and the beech, we've accelerated succession. We've put it to maple beech right away. If, however, it's at that stem exclusion phase and we see there's a bunch of oaks in there that are about to die, these oaks are early successional, and if they don't get a piece of the canopy, they don't dominate. So if we go ahead and remove everything except the oaks, we've now moved succession back in successional time. So it depends on which species you're selecting for. If you're selecting for an early successional species, that's backwards in the successional direction. Now, backwards, I don't necessarily mean site productivity is going backwards, because very often, if you look at remember that S curve where I said the fastest growth is right in these middle years, not the early years, not the late years. That holds true for the individual trees, it holds true for stands of trees, and it actually holds true for forest types and forest communities. This last slide right here, there are foresters that would say, oh yeah, this stand here is decadent and it needs regeneration. What they mean by decadent is the fact that these trees are so old and so big that it is entirely possible that they are decaying faster than they're growing. And there are immense amounts of nutrients and water that's being sloughed from this site, and they're not producing the value that we could select for here. If we were looking for sugar pines, we could get far more sugar pine nuts if we had way more. Remember the stand density now? Instead of having, 15, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15 gigantic, enormous trees and a couple of baskets full of pine cones, we could have 400 pine trees and maybe 12 baskets of pine cones. You'd have fewer pine cones per pine tree, but more total pine cones. So if your values were for the photosynthetic productivity, an earlier stage will be more photosynthetically productive. This, however, is a very unique ecosystem. It's an old growth red pine, redwood ecosystem. I think that the heritage value, the legacy value of this, the inspiration value of this is the most significant part of this right here, not necessarily timber, because this tree can be hollow on the inside if it's rotting faster.
All right, here's, by the way, Justin said with his personal location, the water table's 40 inches or so. Should I be concerned about surface water? This is back to your answer you gave a little bit ago.
The water table is only 40 inches deep? Is that
he'll probably answer. I don't know
because if the water table is only 40 inches deep, you may have problems growing lots of things because it's so wet. If it's 40 inches of rain a year, that's a different story. And yeah, it doesn't hurt to have storages of water, whether it's in tanks or ponds, because there will be dry spells that you want to get through. You may want to have water storage for watering livestock, water storage for fire control around the home, that sort of things. And just as far as general water stored, what'll dramatically help that is increased organic matter, root mass in the soil.
So Garrett's got a great question. He says, hope it's not off topic. Just wondering, what do you do about stumps if one begins this journey with a clear cut?
Well, I began this journey with a clear cut. Well, once I was on my own, moved out of my parents' house, began with a clear cut, and I just let them rot because there were just too many for them to deal with. There was 80 acres my first clear cut, and I just couldn't handle it. Nowadays on New Forest Farm, when I cut stumps, I cut them. First of all, cut it high so it's convenient and easy to cut. Then I'll make one last cut really flush close to the ground. And depending on the species, if it's like a poplar, I'll inoculate with oyster mushroom spawn. If it's some sort of maple or basswood, I'll put in lion's mane mushroom spawn. So I'll go ahead and inoculate them with mushroom spawn. There's a friend of mine up in Maine who noticed that I was planting acorns, and he had a brilliant idea. I was going around sticking a little dibble bar and putting acorns in the ground. This is up in Maine, in the clear cut. And he said, well, where are you getting all those acorns from? I says, well, down in Massachusetts, there's universities. They're considered a hazard. I just go in and I just sweep up piles and piles and piles and piles. I get truckloads of them. He says, well, can you get me some acorns? Oh, sure, no problem. So I went and I got him a whole bunch of acorns. What he did is he would take a crowbar and poke holes underneath the stumps and throw the acorns in down in the hole and leave it open, and then turn his pigs loose. And then when he ran out of acorns, he'd use apples, and he used the pigs to root out the stumps. You can use stump grinders, forestry mulchers. It just depends on your resources and your overall goals. On the first properties that I went, I'm just going to be planting more trees anyways. I could care less that there's some stumps in the way. I know they're going to either rot eventually, or if they're ones that are going to sprout back from the root, I can just cut them later if they're going to interfere with my trees.
Cool. Well, everybody, I'm going to do a couple more, but realize, again, when you get the replay for this, all these questions and answers, and if there aren't answered, we'll get them later, will be on a handout. There'll be a download that you get with the replay. This is, I'm going to do two more. One, Justin did say it is in coastal Delaware, and that was just a comment, so he is in a coastal area. And this is one from Sam. I asked Karen about getting some Korean pine scion wood to try some grafting into my white pines. I'm treating it as an experiment, but was curious if you've done this with any success.
Well, okay, so now I know who you are. Yeah, we'll get you some scion wood. It's not a problem. I planted in New Forest Farm, I planted 1,000 white pines that I got from the DNR because I had read somewhere once upon a time that you could graft Korean pine onto white pine. So I planted all these white pines knowing that at the time, I mean, think about this 20 years ago, right now, it's very difficult to get Korean pine seedlings. There's hardly any available out there. There's hardly any demand at all. One of the largest suppliers of Korean pine in the country. 20 years ago, it was even worse. So I'm going to graft what Korean pines I do have onto white pine rootstock. Well, I never got around to doing it. So now I have a nice young stand of 8, 10-inch diameter white pines that I never grafted to Korean pine. They're so similar looking that I had Dr. Michael, he's from University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point, Dr. Michael Demchek. He's walking by this one stand of trees. He goes, gee, Mark, what's wrong with your white pines? There's just something wrong with them. I can't quite figure out what it is. And I'm like, yeah, look at it. The bark is just not quite, it's a little anemic looking, isn't it? Yeah, it's a little bit yellower. It should be more vibrant green. And like the needles have this little pale kind of white on it. I said, yeah, that's because they're Korean pines, Mike. So they're so similar that even a PhD professor at the university, a tree guy, couldn't tell the difference.
Wow. I think that's a good point to stop. I think we covered most of the questions here. Mark, as always, awesome.
All right.
If you have other questions, guys, put them on the Facebook page or put them into the comments on the replay from this. We did have one guy, Mark, Trevor, that's asking about courses and things, and we gave him and said that we're going to be turning into the course. He's actually going to become a member and get the elites and everything else, so that's cool. Anyway, I think that's it for us, everybody. Come and listen to our 2 sessions or watch them tomorrow. Mark, thank you, and we'll talk, I'm sure, very soon.
We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.